The aim of today's conference is to bring together academics and urban professionals from museum curation to architects and urban planners to discuss how to research, create, and represent sensory urban environments. Cities are not only driving economic forces in Europe, but crucial entities providing a sense of place in a globalizing world. And in this connection, it is important to examine the role of the senses in placemaking and attachments. As you know, this is the final conference of the network, which in its long version is entitled Sensory Cities, Researching, Representing, and Curating Sensory Emotional Landscapes of Urban Environments. We will bring together the key findings from the different workshops during the project, drawing the experience of 3 cities that underwent different processes, but interlinked and connected ones of regeneration in Europe, London, Cologne, and Barcelona. A range of cross-disciplinary, cross-European, and cross-professional panels will discuss what academics and professionals can learn from each other in terms of methods, how sensory methods can help to curate the outside city inside the museum, and how the senses can inform urban design in an ethical way. In particular, which structures we actually need to translate research into practice to create participatory approaches for sensory design. In the evening, we will launch a sensory digital think kit developed throughout the discussions and experimental methods trialed across 3 cities to research the sensory geography of place. But before giving the word over to our panelists to discuss these questions, we want to briefly outline the ideas that led to the creation of the network and some of the discussions that we would like to develop today. Starting with the fundamental question of why the senses actually matter for our understanding and construction of the city. Next one. As everybody knows intuitively, we encounter the city foremost as a corporal space. We smell, we feel the sun, we are repulsed by something we might see, or we might enjoy it through walking. Focusing on the senses in urban life connect the lived, imagined, and physical city. Cities are not just built economic or political landscape, but actively experienced and therefore lived places. Whenever there's a change in the urban landscape, whether the repaving of a street, the inclusion or destruction of trees, or the construction of a new building, the sensory landscape is reframed and thereby new sensory emotional relations between the users and the places are created. The politics of the city are expressed physically through the sensory landscape. We can experience which neighborhoods are being invested in, whose history is regarded as worth conserving and presenting, or whose practices are fostered through the licensing of certain shops over others. A focus on the senses and emotions in the city is therefore important in understanding the city as a political domain that links the personal lives of its diverse users with broader structural changes in the city's history, politics, and economics. Moreover, as Carlos and Judith Carrera from the CCCB pointed out, the senses can provide a relatable entry point for people to discuss the places they interact with in surprisingly complex terms. For instance, public space is a very political topic, which, discussed in normative terms, can produce rather abstract debates which filter out non-expert opinion. However, if you ask people how a given public space makes them feel and question them regarding why, what elements of that space they perceive immediately, which ones emerge over time, and so on. Many debates regarding the use and quality of public space emerge, and we can start having a more participatory debate about them. The senses can thus provide us with insights into people's perceptions of their own lives and life around them. At the same time, however, the senses are fairly unreliable. We notice certain things, but not others. And moreover, our senses are not just the product of our biology, but they are conditioned by our experience, by our upbringing, and by the values and ideas around us. Therefore, they need a substantial degree of contextualization to adequately inform perception. For this reason, we need precise questions and methods to actually hone into their relation to the city. Yet, despite what some scholars have described as a sensory revolution in the humanities and social sciences, and the very exciting developments in the natural sciences, and some of you who have been listening to Radio 4 might have heard this week's series about all the development in science and technology that gives us more senses than we thought we had. But despite all of this, there has been relatively little explicit exchange on methods between academic disciplines and even less between different urban professionals and academics. The spark for the network was therefore our own search for better methodologies across disciplines. And we created the network as an experimental place to exchange and develop ideas by bringing people together who would not normally encounter each other, but who have a common interest in the urban sensorium, and to make these findings accessible to broader audiences. The underlying question we pursued started with a very, very broad one. What are the methods that exist, and how can we exchange and develop them? And then we have sort of a kind of subset of questions that are more procedural. But essentially, it was a place for experimentation to bring together the plethora of methods in different disciplines and to create a common space for dialogue. To understand general principles as well as specificities, we had the idea to ground our discussion both in different European cities that have different experience of regeneration, that are all very diverse, but in different ways, and that have common historical features. So they have things that bind them together, but that also differentiate them, as well as to embody our research through practical fieldwork days, where we would go out in a street that had a long historical sort of layer of different sensory experience, as well as recent history of regeneration, and trial out some of these methods. In London, we focused on different forms of interactive or observational methods on Whitechapel. In Cologne, we looked at mapping different senses from touch to vision. And in Barcelona, we focused more strongly on how we would communicate sensory power relations to different audiences. The broad interdisciplinary exchange, I think for all of us, really transformed our outlook on sensory research. Through the talks and the fieldwork, we learned a lot about new and different approaches that we had not encountered before and certainly never had combined. And here is, sort of a rather long list of how participants would classify their own methods in alphabetical order. We felt inspired by the creative ways how artists and curators mediate sensory experience. The interprofessional discussions also, I think, made academics much more aware of the practical constraints policymakers and urban professionals face, and in turn, the more long-term academic and philosophical perspective helped to think about the senses more broadly for practitioners. Having the workshop in 3 different cities allowed also glimpses at how professional, administrative, and legal ecologies shape the frame for collaboration across theory and praxis. And we found that some things were possible to implement in some cities and not others because of these particular professional and legal ecologies. So this helped to think about how good practice could actually be translated from one context to another. But for me, some of the challenges of this interdisciplinary work was probably even more interesting than learning about how to do participant observation or record certain sounds digitally, as they revealed quite fundamental questions about difference in opinion, about the nature of the senses, but also how we actually get insights in terms of methods and questions. And these questions need open discussion, because otherwise we talk at cross purposes. And we felt that sort of as the workshop progressed, we got better at finding out what the underlying things were where we actually not understanding each other. First of all, there was considerable debate about what actually counts as a method. Do we just think about the data recording, or do we think about the whole cycle, sort of the methodology from the ideology or the theory that frames our research questions, then the data gathering, and then the interpretation? And for us, it's very much this whole, it's not just how you technically collect, but how you frame your intellectual inquiry. Divergences, moreover, were underpinned by considerably different ideas about the relationship between the environment, the mind, and the body. And here you have a quote that's actually from Churchill about, we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. But we had a lot of disagreement about whether it's actually the environment that shapes us or whether it is our ideas that shape how we perceive the environment. There were also quite blurry lines in terms of concepts about what we mean by senses versus emotions, affect, and experience that need much more theoretical demarcation. Other debates emerged about whether we actually trust or distrust the opinion of experts. Different theories about the relationship between the economic and the social, and sometimes quite fundamental disagreements about what and for whom public space is actually there for. Finally, many different assumptions about the nature of the senses were in the room. And these are linked to the fundamental uncertainties in the natural sciences, but also in philosophy and in anthropology about how we actually think about the number of the senses. Are there 5, like Aristotle thought, or are they, up to 22 or 23, like some scientists would now advance, and how they interact? While the cultural nature of the senses is, of course, very familiar from the literature, it was the visceral experience of walking around in different groups and recording our different sensations that really brought this point home. And I think we were all quite struck by how, and this was sort of done for the German press, so it's slightly staged. But I think we all knew that what we see is kind of guided by what we're looking for or what we know. But we probably hadn't thought that this was also true for what we smelled, how we felt temperature on our skin, the sounds we recorded. And this was very, very much conditioned by years of professional training. And which I think one of the in some ways most simple but most important findings from the network was actually how much we need interdisciplinary teams in order to combine expertises and make us aware of the range of sensations one can observe through different frameworks and different trainings in a given place. And this is also, Monica will talk about this a little bit more later, in the ThinkKit, so that we had initially thought about it, we can just sort of transmit methods, and then it became much more how we actually reframe the frameworks through which we think. The aim of the conference today is to push the discussion further and to reflect on how we can develop research, curation, design, and policy. The first panel will discuss how academics and urban professionals interested in the senses can learn from each other's methodological approaches. And in particular, it will discuss how we actually deal, if we try to map the senses, how do we deal with the fundamental uncertainties that we actually have about the nature and interaction of the senses. The second panel will then focus on how we can mediate and enhance sensory education through the museum space. Again, throughout the discussion, more and more the role that city museums can play in actually mediating the outside and the inside city and connecting the past, the present, and the future through curation, through experience, and through debate came to the fore. And here again, we will reflect on how we can use sensory methods, not so much simply to recreate, but in order to mediate and to create debate. And finally, the last panel will then focus on how we can implement this into urban policy, urban design, and architectural planning by looking at what some of the obstacles are to implement research into design and which kind of structures we need if we want to implement the census in an ethical and participatory way. And finally, in the evening, we will launch the sensory think it. But before I do this, there's one, one intervention that I think we're particularly proud of to have in the middle of the day, and that is Kate McLean's artistic intervention to offer you a smell, sort of an indoor smell walk of this space, as we found that as academics, but also as professionals, we were particularly touched through artistic ways of experiencing, but also mediating some of these more abstract insights. And Kate will say a little bit more after the first panel about, what you need to do to take part in this experience. But now I hand over to Monica to introduce the Think It.
Right. So basically, Astrid has introduced the overview of today and also the aims of the network. And what I want to do for a few minutes is just to give you a taster, because I think it's a long day and we're not sure everybody will stay till 6 o'clock, but a taster of our public interface of the project, the Think Kit. So the aim behind this digital device is to showcase in an accessible manner the discussions and methodological insights gained from all the workshops in all 3 cities, but also provide a resource, we hope, for urban professionals, museum curators, educators, and the general public who want to engage with the sensory and sensory thinking. So I need to also mention that we've done this on a very reduced budget. So our dream is to have £1 million next and to really go into detail and use film and virtual reality and all the latest technology to enhance it. But yeah, this was done on a very reduced budget. So we deliberately have called it actually Think It. We first wanted to call it Toolkit, but what we realized that the Think It really summarizes ongoing discussions that haven't finished yet and that we hope to progress today, really. But also the Think It shows some of the trialing of methods and methodological approaches, rather than being, a finished toolkit that needs to be implemented in this and that way. It's not finished at all. It's more a suggestion on how, or it has a lot of suggestions on how to think about the senses. And it's only a starting point, to be really honest, of a field that still needs a lot of exploring to do. So we consider the Think It then very much as a suggestive digital resource that is, the starting point for ideas on how to combine very different forms of knowledge and research rather than this end product. And we describe consciously what we call the methodologies as approximations. Because to be really honest, and it become clear, I think, later in my presentation as well, we only spent about 5 hours on each street, and we don't claim to, have found out any super duper new methods or methodologies, but we wanted to really just spark ideas and have this kind of cross-professional discussion between the people looking at these streets and what we could learn from each other. So, as several sociologists have pointed out, the social sciences cannot claim exclusively anymore jurisdiction over techniques of investigating society anymore. So part of the aim of the project was precisely to learn from urban professionals, whether it is museum curators, architects, urban planners, community groups or artists, on how they think about, research or represent the urban sensorium. As Les Bach and Nirmal Purva highlight, it is important to expand, especially for academics, I think, and challenge prevailing research conventions and find new ways to expose ourselves to the openness, but also the liveliness of social events we try to get close to. And I think also in terms of writing styles and languages, there's lots more of exploration to do. I mean, most of us know that academia seems to restrict your language rather than, open it up. So one way is to focus on the often evasive and fleeting, sensory realm to understand better the complexity and contradictions inherent in urban living, with the idea being to generate, as again Bach and Purva state, better questions rather than fixed answers. So while the official launch then of this ThinkIt is for tonight, I want to give you just a brief taster of what it includes and what it's all about, and highlight some of the methodological approximations that emerged from especially the Barcelona workshop. So let me briefly show you then what happened in Barcelona. The Barcelona workshop was hosted in a neighborhood called El Raval, the former red light district of Barcelona, now being gentrified and regenerated with highly diverse ethnic population. And we were so very lucky to be at the Centro de Cultura Contemporánea. And the main focus, as Astrid already told you, of the Barcelona workshop was really to explore the relationship between senses, power, and society. So we had a series of talks from academics, urban branding experts, community activists who brought out the importance of the senses, framing not only Barcelona's ever more branded identity, but also, more importantly for us, the contradictions and contestations that emerge from this kind of Barcelona postcard version and, the lived reality of being in the city. So the methodological emphasis then of the Barcelona fieldwork the next day was how we could represent sensory power relations to different audiences. And it was quite a big challenge to really do that. And they really had to think about each of these groups on how to make the fleeting, the sensory, tangible for audiences like young people, policymakers, locals, or museum curators. So if we go into the museum curator group that you see there, the group, had to think about how can we focus on the auditory sense to really, express power on a street to museum curators and to make it educational for museums. And they focused on the auditory sense, like I said, but they also focused on the what they identified as a predominant spatial theme on this particular street, namely thresholds. So physical thresholds reflected dramatically changes, for example, in the soundscapes they found out, switching from noisy to quiet environments, allowing this group to appreciate sounds and acoustics of different spaces, and the relationship between the public and the private realm, which are very fluid, especially in this particular neighborhood of El Raval. So I want to show you one example where the group is entering basically from the street into a church, and it's reflected in the soundscape of this particular walk. So the group did that for about 10 thresholds they could identify, and they really thought about, what can we actually say about social power relations by exploring the changes of sounds within and around these thresholds. And what they realized is that it offered an opportunity not only for their own awareness of the different qualities of public spaces, but also, to really think about public space as an embodied experience rather than a spatial practice only. The group created then this kind of threshold map of the area and tried to answer questions such as who creates the spaces that facilitate and enforce certain sounds? Who has the control over the city's soundscape? What role do sounds play in making different groups visible or invisible, or ignored or perceived? The intervention showed that one way that public space can be appropriated and mediated is precisely through sounds, which we often don't pay much attention to. So emphasizing really the doing of public life, whether it is by builders, scrap metal collectors, or even musical instruments that, or TVs that played, their sound from the flats above down onto the street, and illustrating that public space, therefore, is constituted through this kind of intermingling of private and public soundscapes that are produced by different social groups, and whereby they really create their acknowledged presence. Meaning, what I'm trying to say, it's not just what you see, but it's what you experience. What all the city's workshops brought really to light, whether through formal presentations or through the actual fieldwork days, is how important the senses are in structuring and mediating daily urban life, both in situ, but also historically and digitally. And I just want to briefly reflect on these two aspects, the historical and the digital. So to understand and research current sensory relations in cities and their role in social economic stratification processes, it is important to think like Les Bach, who influences me a lot, and Nirmal Purwa say, to avoid the trap of the now. Yeah, the sensory isn't just about the now, but it needs to be also attentive to the large-scale timescales and historical timeframes, and ask questions such as, what role have the senses played in framing the represented identity of a street or a place over time, for example? Or what kind of spatial practices, and therefore sensory practices, are encouraged or disencouraged over time through regeneration of different neighborhoods? In terms of the digitals, we will hear much more from Gillian Rose in a minute, but I thought one important thing to take into account is that the tools and devices for researching urban culture have now been extended by digital culture. But also the ways that places are lived, represented, and imagined are influenced by the confluence of social media and traditional media outlets. So we really need to take the digital into account in the emergence of a new urban aesthetic, of new sensory landscapes. Our workshops in Cologne, London, and Barcelona really showed that urban planning and design are deeply sensory professions. And not just because they shape the spatial and sensory reality of our cities, but because they structure thereby the public and personal relations which are sensed and perceived by individuals. We also learned a lot from city museums that played a crucial role in that not only they preserve the social and therefore the sensory lived history of places, but they also provide space to explore the sensory dimensions of urban living and offer the possibility to raise awareness amongst the greater public. And then I must say I've learned specifically a lot, and that's why we really wanted to have Kate McLean here, but there were also other artists like the Theater of the Senses in Barcelona, for example. I learned a lot from artists and how they communicate and think about the sensory, because they provide not only a different perspective, but a much more playful approach that really brings the sensory aspects out, in a very dynamic and engaging way. And I think we academics especially have a lot to learn from that. Lastly, academics often brought back the importance of focusing on the ways in which the way we sense, as it's not, as we know, a natural process, but social and cultural. So it's always, and I really want to emphasize that, senses are always linked to power relations in society. So to conclude, I just want to say that our cross-professional and interdisciplinary network has highlighted not only how important it is to have, this money that we got from the AHRC to explore ideas, to create discussions and trial things out. But especially, I think what's been unique is the cross-professionalism of this network, where you really have, manifold approaches to the senses, unexpected approaches, and that come together to really, find new languages, new methods, and new ways of thinking about the senses. And I also, especially at current times, I can't help myself but to also point out the international perspective of this project, which I hope, despite what's going on with Brexit, will continue, especially in the UK, but also in Europe overall. because, not only, do the census constitute cities in very different ways, or cities constitute the census in different ways, but also we learned so much, the different professionals, the museum curators, the academics from our different national research contexts. And especially, again, academia, but I think we also noticed urban planning, etc. It's very nationally bounded still. And there's very few places where there's dialogue across the world, between different perspectives. And I think we need to really carry on doing that. And I hope that some of the ideas will make people go out and look for international grants to do that more.